What would you do if the most feared man in the city suddenly pulled you onto his lap in front of every powerful person in the room? And only later, when the shooting started, did you understand it was the single thing keeping you alive? The whole ballroom froze. Crystal glasses stopped halfway to painted lips. A man who could end a bloodline with one lazy nod had just reached out and claimed the soft, overlooked woman everyone had spent the evening mocking, and no one dared to breathe. It looked like possession. It was protection. This is a story of hidden worth, buried secrets, and the fierce devotion of a dangerous man who saw a treasure where the rest of the world saw only a joke. Rosa Delgado had learned long ago how to make herself invisible in rooms that wanted her gone. She was a soft, generously curved woman poured into a deep sapphire gown she had saved 3 months to afford, and she stood near a marble pillar praying the shadows would swallow her whole. She did not belong among the glittering elite swirling beneath the chandeliers of the Vitali Gala, and every judgmental glance reminded her of it. But Rosa was not there to be admired. She was a senior forensic auditor, one of the sharpest financial minds the city had ever produced, and for 6 brutal months she had been buried in offshore ledgers and shell companies, hunting a missing fortune. She had found it. Tucked into her small beaded clutch was a flash drive that named exactly who inside the Vitali organization had been siphoning millions into the dark, and she needed only one private moment with the man at the center of the room to hand it over. That man was Damiano Vitali, and he was the reason the temperature seemed to drop wherever he moved. He sat in a high-backed velvet chair like a king surveying a court, broad-shouldered and terrifyingly still, dressed in a midnight suit that had surely cost more than Rosa earned in a year. His dark eyes swept the ballroom with the detached boredom of a predator. Women drifted toward him in silk and diamonds, socialites and imported beauties who laughed too brightly at his silence, and he looked through every one of them as though they were empty air. He was surrounded, and he was profoundly, bone-deep alone. She had been mocked her whole life for the space her body took up, and she had built a quiet fortress around her heart to survive it. She squared her shoulders. She only had to cross the room. She had no idea that 2 separate men in that ballroom were already watching her, and that only one of them wanted her to reach him alive. Well, look what the tide dragged in. The voice was high and sharp and dripping with venom, and Rosa's stomach dropped before she even turned. Camilla Fontaine stood blocking her path, a razor-thin socialite in a barely there silver gown, a woman who had been openly campaigning to become the next Mrs. Vitali for the better part of a year. She let her eyes travel down Rosa's body with theatrical disgust. "I think you're lost, sweetheart," she said, loud enough that heads began to turn. "The kitchen is through the doors at the back. Or did you already clear the catering carts?" A ripple of cruel laughter moved through the nearby crowd. Rosa felt the old, familiar heat flood her cheeks, felt her spine begin to curl inward, felt every instinct she had ever built screaming at her to shrink, to apologize, to disappear. But she gripped her clutch until her knuckles whitened, the flash drive pressing hard into her palm through the beaded satin, and she made herself stand tall. "I'm here on business, Miss Fontaine," Rosa said, her voice steadier than she felt. "If you'll excuse me." She moved to step around the woman, but Camilla shifted with her, blocking her again, eyes glittering with malice. "Business?" Camilla scoffed. "What business could a woman like you possibly have with Damiano Vitali? Look at you. You take up the space of 3 real women. You're sweating through that gown, and you reek of desperation. A man like him doesn't even see people like you. You're invisible. No," she added, smiling like a knife, "you're worse. You're a joke." Emboldened, Camilla tilted her glass so a few drops of red wine splashed deliberately onto the hem of Rosa's sapphire gown. "Run along home before you embarrass yourself further," she purred. "This is a room for thoroughbreds, not cattle." The cruelty of it struck Rosa like a physical blow, and for one paralyzing second she was a mock teenager again. Then the entire ballroom simply went silent. The jazz quartet faltered mid-note. The low hum of conversation evaporated, and the crowd began to part, backing away as if repelled by a magnetic force, because Damiano Vitali had risen from his chair and was walking directly toward them. He moved with a terrifying, unhurried grace, his expression carved from stone, and his dark eyes were locked entirely on Rosa. He did not so much as glance at Camilla. Camilla's sneer melted instantly into a radiant, desperate smile. She smoothed her silver dress and stepped forward, reaching for Damiano's sleeve. "Damiano, darling," she cooed, "I was just dealing with a bit of a pest." Security really should. He did not break his stride. He did not even acknowledge her hand on his arm. His broad chest caught her shoulder and shifted her aside with the effortless dismissal of a man moving a nuisance out of his path. And Camilla stumbled, her heels skidding on the marble, gasping in shock. Damiano stopped directly in front of Rosa. Up close, he was overwhelming, a foot taller than her, smelling of dark tobacco and cedar, and something underneath that whispered pure danger. His fathomless eyes moved over her flushed face, the tremble of her full lips, the proud, defiant set of her jaw. For 3 agonizing seconds, no one in that room breathed. Then he reached out, his large, calloused hand wrapping around her thick wrist. It was not a painful grip. It was absolute. And with one smooth, powerful pull, he drew her forward off her balance and down. And before Rosa could process the movement, she landed heavily, her soft, generous curves settling directly onto Damiano Vitali's lap. The ballroom erupted into silent, collective shock. Glasses lowered. Jaws went slack. Camilla dropped her wine entirely, the crystal shattering against the marble in a splash of dark red. Rosa's heart slammed against her ribs. She was sitting sideways across the thighs of the most dangerous man in the city, her breath coming in panicked gasps, certain she was crushing him and at the center of a humiliation she would never survive. She scrambled to rise, cheeks burning. "Mr. Vitali, I'm so sorry," she stammered. But his arm wrapped around her thick waist, a heavy band of possessive iron, and anchored her firmly in place. He pulled her flush against his solid chest, his fingers splaying wide across the curve of her hip. "Sit still, Tesoro," he commanded, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through his chest and straight into her spine. He did not look strained. He did not look disgusted. He held her weight as though she were made of nothing but air, and he lifted his eyes to the frozen crowd, letting them land at last on a pale, trembling Camilla. "You seem to be under the mistaken impression," he said, his voice deadly quiet, yet carrying across the silent room like a gunshot, "that you decide who belongs in my presence." Camilla's mouth opened and closed. "This woman is my personal guest," Damiano continued, his thumb tracing an idle, intimate circle against the velvet at Rosa's hip. "She takes up exactly as much room as I want her to. And if anyone in this room ever disrespects her again, they will not simply be escorted out. They will disappear. Am I understood?" The threat was not an exaggeration. It was a terrifying, real-life promise, and every soul in that ballroom felt it settle into their bones. Camilla nodded frantically, tears of humiliation spilling over her lashes before she turned and fled. The crowd found sudden fascination with their shoes and their drinks. The jazz quartet, desperate to break the silence, hastily resumed playing. Rosa sat frozen on his lap, her mind spinning, dizzy with the impossibility of it. He had defended her. He had claimed her in front of the entire underworld. And then the romantic illusion cracked, because Damiano leaned his head down, his lips brushing the sensitive skin just beneath her ear, and whispered words that had nothing to do with desire. "Did you bring the data from the audit, Tesoro?" Rosa went rigid. The lap pull had not been a defense of her honor. It had been a tactical maneuver, a way to mark her as his own in the eyes of his men, making her untouchable while letting them speak with their mouths hidden from the spies and cameras salted through the crowd. "Yes," she breathed, leaning her weight into him to sell the illusion of intimacy, sliding her trembling fingers into her clutch. "It's all here," she murmured, her lips grazing his jaw. "The offshore routing numbers, the shell accounts, and the name of the person bleeding you dry." She slipped the flash drive into the breast pocket of his tuxedo, her heart hammering. Damiano's expression did not change, but she felt the muscles in his chest lock into stone beneath her. "Who?" he asked softly, though the underlying tone was lethal. She turned her head, their faces a breath apart. "Franco," she whispered, "your underboss. He's been funneling the money through a company registered under his mother's maiden name for 6 months. Damiano did not flinch. But across the ballroom, Franco was watching them intently, his handsome face a careful mask, his right hand resting far too still inside his tailored jacket, exactly where a shoulder holster would sit. And in that instant Rosa understood, with a cold plunge of dread, that the invisible auditor Franco had dismissed as a nobody had just handed his death warrant to the boss. The real danger had not even begun. Damiano did not break eye contact with his traitor. To the rest of the ballroom, the syndicate king was simply murmuring to his new, unconventional companion, but to the trained killers in the room, the subtle shift in his posture was a declaration of war. Rosa could feel the violent acceleration of his heartbeat against her shoulder, could feel the raw, coiled tension radiating from his massive frame. "Mr. Vitali," she whispered, trembling. "He knows. Franco is calculating the exits." "I know, Tesoro," Damiano murmured, and despite the lethal circumstances his voice was startlingly gentle. His hand slid from her waist to grip her soft upper arm with reassuring firmness. "When I stand, you stay exactly behind me. You do not look at him. You do not stop moving. Understand?" Rosa nodded frantically, her sapphire gown rustling. Damiano rose in one fluid, powerful motion, bringing her up with him, tucking her securely behind his broad shoulder, shielding her from Franco's line of sight. He caught the eye of his loyal head of security, a mountain of a man named Bruno, standing near the private elevators. Bruno needed no verbal command. He tapped his earpiece, and 4 men in dark suits detached seamlessly from the crowd, forming a loose, protective diamond around Damiano and Rosa. "We're leaving," Damiano said softly. They moved toward the grand doors, their pace measured but urgent. Rosa struggled to keep up in her heels, her heart a trapped bird against her ribs. "Leaving so soon, boss?" The voice cut through the murmurs. Franco had moved with terrifying speed, intercepting them just feet from the exit, a polite, venomous smile painted on his face, 2 of his own loyalists flanking him with hands hovering near their waistbands. "The atmosphere has grown stale, Franco," Damiano said, his voice dropping an octave into chilling authority. "And my guest is tired." Franco's eyes flicked to Rosa, contempt stripping the glamour from his face. "An auditor, Damiano, really?" He sneered. "I thought your tastes ran more refined. She seems like a heavy burden to carry, especially when she's poking her nose into accounts where she doesn't belong." Rosa gasped quietly. He knew exactly how she had found the money. "The only burden I carry," Damiano countered smoothly, taking a deliberate step forward, his sheer size dwarfing the underboss, "is the weight of incompetence within my own ranks." "Step aside." "I don't think I will," Franco whispered, dropping the facade entirely. 50 million, Damiano. You have more than enough. The families are tired of your rules. They want growth. I was simply facilitating a necessary transition. By stealing from my blood, Damiano said, his eyes dead and cold. Franco's hand twitched inside his jacket. "It's nothing personal. It's just accounting." Before Franco could draw, Damiano moved with a speed that defied his massive frame. His fist connected with Franco's throat with the sickening crunch of collapsing cartilage, and in the same instant Bruno and the loyal guards drew their suppressed weapons. Chaos erupted. Women screamed, their gowns tearing as they dove beneath banquet tables. A champagne tower crashed to the marble in a glittering, explosive wave. Damiano spun, wrapping both arms around Rosa and tackling her to the floor as a bullet shattered the doorframe exactly where her head had been a heartbeat before. They crashed down together, Damiano twisting in midair so that his heavily muscled back took the brunt of the impact, cradling her against his chest. Rosa sobbed in pure terror, her face buried in the lapel of his midnight suit, the smell of gunpowder and blood mixing with his cedar cologne. "Stay down," he roared over the screams. He rolled, pulling her behind an overturned catering table. "I can't run fast enough, Damiano," she cried, hyperventilating as she looked at her soft thighs, terrified her size would be the reason he died. "Leave me. I gave you the drive." He grabbed her face with both hands, his thumbs aggressively wiping away her tears, his dark eyes burning with a fierce, possessive intensity that halted her panic mid-breath. "Do not ever tell me to leave you," he snarled, his voice vibrating with raw dominance. "You are exactly the size I need you to be. You are perfect, and you are mine to protect. Now breathe. We are walking out of here together." But even as he said it, Rosa's frantic mind was already racing ahead, because she knew something Franco did not, something that would decide whether this ended in a bloodbath or in checkmate. The armored car tore through the rain-slicked streets, its engine roaring as it evaded any tails. Inside the dim, soundproofed cabin, the silence was deafening. Rosa sat shivering against the plush leather, her sapphire gown ruined, streaked with champagne and dirt, and a few drops of blood that were not her own. Damiano sat beside her, calm despite his bruised knuckles and torn jacket. He poured a measure of amber liquid from a crystal decanter and pressed the glass into her trembling hands. "Drink," he ordered softly. "It will steady you." Rosa took a shaky sip, the whiskey settling the tremors in her stomach, and looked at him without the lens of terror for the first time. "Why did you pull me onto your lap?" she asked quietly. "In the ballroom, before any of the shooting. You could have just taken the drive." Damiano swirled his whiskey, his dark eyes tracing the soft curve of her jaw. "Because Camilla was disrespecting what belongs to me," he said simply. "And because the moment you sat on my lap, every spy in that room saw you become untouchable. It bought us the seconds we needed." "I don't belong to you," Rosa replied instinctively, her professional independence flaring even now. "I was hired by your holding company. This was a financial transaction." Damiano let out a low, dark chuckle that sent a shiver straight through her. "A financial transaction," he repeated, sliding closer until his thigh pressed intimately against hers. "Is that what you call it? You think I let just anyone breach my inner circle? I have been watching you for 3 months, Rosa. I watched you sit in your office at 2 in the morning eating cold takeout, dismantling offshore accounts that Ivy League lawyers couldn't crack. I watched you fight for space in a world that tries to make you feel small. You are brilliant. You are ruthless in your own quiet way, and you are the most beautiful thing I have looked at in a decade." Rosa's breath hitched. She was used to men looking past her, or looking at her with pity, but Damiano looked at her like she was the only meal he had ever wanted. "Franco is finished," he continued, his tone shifting back to business, though his hand stayed possessively on her knee. "But the 50 million is already in a Cayman shell account. He locked it behind biometric protocols this morning, before the gala. It will take my people weeks to break in. The families will read this as weakness." Rosa stopped shaking. The mention of the accounts flipped a switch in her brilliant mind, and the terrified woman receded, replaced by the auditor who commanded respect in boardrooms across the globe. "You think I'm just an accountant, Damiano?" she asked, a slow, confident smile spreading across her lips. He raised an eyebrow, captivated by the sudden shift. "Franco was arrogant," Rosa explained, pulling out her encrypted phone. "He used a standard proxy to route the funds, and he reused his passwords across his redundant servers. Amateur. When I was deep in the data yesterday, I didn't just track the money. I assumed he might try to secure it the moment he realized I was auditing the books." "What did you do?" Damiano asked, leaning in. "I hard-coded a reverse siphon into the shell company's root ledger," she said, her eyes flashing with triumph. "A dormant script. It activates the instant an unauthorized failsafe tries to move the money out of that account. It doesn't just block the transfer." His eyes widened slightly. "It redirects it." "Exactly," she confirmed, pressing the final command on her screen. "Franco's death triggered his automated dead man's switch 10 minutes ago. His system tried to route the 50 million to a rival cartel. My script intercepted every dollar." She turned the phone to face him. On the glowing screen, a progress bar hit 100%. "The 50 million has just been deposited back into your private accounts. And as a bonus, my script forwarded the routing numbers of the cartel's laundering network straight to the Federal Cybercrimes Division. Your enemies are being raided as we speak." Damiano Vitali stared at the screen, and then at the soft, brilliant woman beside him, and something in his fathomless eyes cracked wide open. But there was one loose end left in the dark, and neither of them yet knew it was already moving toward them. What Rosa did not know, what even Damiano did not yet know, was that Franco had never truly been the top of the pyramid. In the days that followed, as Rosa was installed in a fortified penthouse under Damiano's absolute protection, she kept working the numbers, and the numbers kept whispering. There was a second signature buried beneath Franco's, an older, patient hand that had taught the underboss everything he knew about hiding money. It belonged to Matteo Rizzo, Damiano's own consigliere, the silver-haired man who had served the family since Damiano was a boy, the one voice no one ever thought to question. He had used Franco as a blade, and now that the blade was broken, he meant to remove the only person who could expose him. On a night thick with fog off the harbor, When Damiano had been drawn to an emergency meeting across the city, Rizzo made his move. He hijacked the penthouse smart system from outside, dropping the deadbolts, killing the phones, looping the hallway cameras. Rosa was alone. She felt it before she understood it, the sudden wrongness of the silence, the faint muffled thud from the private elevator. She ran to the door. The keypad glowed dead red. She was locked in, and men were coming up. But Rizzo, like every cruel person in Rosa's life, had made the same fatal mistake. He had looked at her soft body and her quiet manner and decided she was helpless. She was not. She sat down at her monitors, forced her panic into a cold, hard corner of her mind, and went to work. First, she armed a dead man's switch of her own, a document dump of every scrap of evidence against Rizzo, primed to fire to Damiano and every captain in the family if she did not enter a cancellation code within 10 minutes. Then she attacked the penthouse itself. The men climbing toward her were using thermal goggles, so she cranked the ambient heat to its maximum and triggered the emergency underfloor heating, flooding the apartment with a white blaze that would blind their optics. And then she did the last thing they would expect. She did not hide in the bedroom or the bathroom, the obvious places. Because of her size, they would assume she could not fit into tight spaces, so she squeezed herself into the narrow utility access behind the pantry shelving, pulling the panel shut just as the front doors blew inward on a breaching charge. She held her breath in the sweltering dark, clutching her backup drive, as heavy boots moved methodically through the wreckage. "Thermal's useless," one man growled. "The whole place is glowing." "She's a big girl," another snarled. "She can't hide well. Check the closets." They tore the penthouse apart, and Rosa did not move, watching the seconds tick down on her watch, sweat pouring down her face. A flashlight beam swept across the pantry, lingering inches from her hidden face. "Clear," the man grunted and moved on. And at the exact moment her watch hit 0 and the dead man's switch fired, 40 miles away, Damiano Vitali's phone lit with a single line of text, and he understood in one heartbeat that the emergency had been a lie and his home was under siege. The lockdown had bought Rosa exactly the minutes she needed. Below her hiding place, the intruders' burner phones erupted with frantic alerts as the evidence hit the family network. The files leaked, one of them shouted, panic cracking his voice. "Rizzo's accounts, all of it, it's everywhere." "Forget the girl," the leader roared. "If Vitali finds out we were here," but he never finished, because the tortured shriek of an engine pushed past its limits ripped through the fog outside, followed by the crash of the gates being rammed open. Damiano had not waited for backup. He had driven through his own perimeter and overridden the executive elevator, and when the doors blew off their tracks, the men in that penthouse learned what it meant to threaten what he loved. The gunfire was not a battle. It was an execution, brief and cold and absolute. 3 suppressed shots, and the heavy thud of bodies on marble. Then silence, broken only by the roar of the overworked heating. "Rosa!" Damiano's voice tore through the ruined apartment, raw with a terror she had never heard from him. She shoved against the access panel, her sweat-slicked hands slipping. "Here," she choked out. "In the pantry." His large hands tore the panel from its frame, and he reached into the narrow dark and pulled her out, cradling her against his chest, carrying her from the blistering kitchen into the cooler wreck of the living room. He set her gently on the one intact chair and dropped to his knees before her, his hands roaming frantically over her arms, her face, her waist, searching for blood. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his chest heaving. "Did they touch you? Look at me. Tell me." "I'm all right," she gasped, greedy for air. "I locked them out. I bypassed the thermals. They couldn't find me." He stared at her disheveled hair and her sweat-soaked blouse and the terrifying brilliance shining out of her, and understood the full magnitude of what she had done, alone, trapped, outnumbered. "You are spectacular," he whispered, pressing his forehead to her knees, his voice thick with something close to worship. He looked up, and his expression hardened into ice. "Rizzo tried to have you killed," he said, the confession slipping out raw. "I'm going to burn his estate to the ground with him inside it." Rosa gripped his lapel before he could rise. "No," she said, her strategic mind already moving. "If you kill him in a rage, his loyalists call it a vendetta and the family fractures." He exposed himself. "The commission has the evidence. Let him walk into their meeting tomorrow believing he won. believing his men succeeded and you're dead. Let him stand before the 5 families and lie to their faces. And then you walk in, with me beside you. A slow, dark, beautiful smile spread across Damiano's face, the smile of a predator recognizing the trap his mate had just laid. Rizzo, the silver-haired consigliere who had smiled at Damiano since childhood, learned the price of underestimating them the very next morning. He stood at the head of the commission's table draped in false grief, mourning the loss of Vitali's foolish auditor, assuring the 5 families that Damiano had gone into hiding, when the heavy doors swung open and the room fell into suffocating silence. Damiano walked in, radiating a murderous calm, and on his arm, unharmed, composed, wearing a custom emerald gown that hugged her generous curves without apology, was Rosa. Rizzo turned the color of wet ash. Rosa stepped forward before he could speak, sliding a sleek tablet onto the mahogany surface. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Every transaction, every forged signature, every dollar you skimmed from these men is documented here, she said calmly, including the 200,000 you wired yesterday to pay for the men who broke into my home. She met the eyes of every boss at that table, men who had dismissed her as a glorified secretary, and watched them realize the soft woman they had ignored held the keys to all their empires and could bankrupt any of them with a keystroke. The Vitali family finds him guilty, Damiano said. Does anyone dispute the evidence? No one spoke. Rizzo lunged for the door, but Damiano was faster, and a single shot rang out, and the traitor crumpled. Yet the karma Rosa had designed was crueler than any bullet. What she left behind buried the man's name in disgrace across the whole underworld, so that even in death he became a warning whispered with contempt. Months later, golden light poured across the terrace of the Vitali estate, and Rosa sat with a tablet balanced on her lap, quietly running the numbers of an empire she now co-ruled. She was no longer hiding. She wore rich colors tailored to celebrate every curve she had once apologized for, and she moved through that fortress not as an outsider, but as its undisputed queen. Damiano stepped out and stopped, simply watching her, the hard predatory lines of his face softening the way they only ever did for her. You're staring, Mr. Vitali, she said without looking up, a smile in her voice. I will never stop staring at you. Tesoro, he replied, crossing to her, gently closing the tablet and drawing her to her feet. I spent my whole life surrounded by people the world called beautiful, and every one of them was hollow. Then a clumsy auditor in a sapphire gown terrified an entire ballroom just by refusing to shrink, and outsmarted every killer in my organization, and I finally understood what real power looks like. He framed her face in his large hands. Do you know what you are? You are the safest place I have ever found, and the most dangerous woman I have ever met, and I intend to spend the rest of my life proving I was worthy of the seat you let me keep beside you. Rosa looked up at the man the whole city feared, a man who bowed to no one and yet bowed, entirely, to her, and for the first time in her overlooked life, she believed she was exactly enough. She had been told she was too much and never enough, all at once, and she had proven the whole cruel world wrong, because she alone had ever offered him something real. If Rosa and Damiano's story of unexpected love, buried secrets, and fierce devotion kept you on the edge of your seat, if you cheered when the overlooked woman outsmarted every enemy in the room and claimed the fearsome man who would burn the world down for her, then do us a small favor before you go. Smash that like button right now. Share this story with someone who believes the safest place can be in the arms of the one everyone fears. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another suspenseful, twist-filled tale of the underestimated soul who finally gets everything she deserves. And drop a comment below and tell us, what was your favorite moment in Rosa and Damiano's story?